Today I want to talk about the Underground Railroad. A few years ago I was attending a DER meeting in Princeton, and a lady came up to me and said, "Phyllis, what is this program you do about a choo-choo train?" I was speechless, if you can imagine. Where I'm sure all of you here today know that the Underground Railroad was neither a railroad nor underground, but a secret system used before the Civil War to smuggle slaves out of the South and lead them to safety in Canada. My remarks will be documented facts from the writing of Colonel William Cochran of Oakland City. In 1907, Cochran wrote a pioneer history of Indiana. In 1915, he wrote the Underground Railroad. Now, Cochran wasn't the greatest writer in the world, but his word cannot be doubted. When Colonel Cochran wrote this book, many families would not allow their names to be mentioned in the book. Therefore, they are lost to history. Cochran dedicated the book to the memory of his father, Colonel James Cochran, Dr. John Posey, Dr. Andrew Lewis, Ira Caswell, and George Hill, 5 brave, true-hearted men who gave of their time and means unstintingly to help liberate the lowly slave. In 1808, the United States prohibited the further importation of slaves, but slavery continued until the Civil War. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law gave the owners of the South the right to come into free states looking for their property and taking them back. The slave owners themselves rarely crossed the Ohio River looking for the slaves, but did offer rewards for the runaways. This brought hundreds of bounty hunters into the states north of the river. You could hear them coming, chains, irons, and whips dangling from their saddles. Mothers grabbed their children and hid. Men and boys were treated harshly if they refused to participate in the hunt. Innocent, respectable people's homes were searched without cause. In 1850, there were 11,000 free Negroes in Indiana. Many were born here, and many of them were kidnapped and taken south and sold into slavery. An anti-slavery league was organized in the East in 1833. Many famous people spoke for this group. One that I recall was Henry Ward Beecher, a famous minister and author. His better-known sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe. You may remember her writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin did a lot to stir up the anti-slavery feelings. Abraham Lincoln recognized the part her book played in bringing on the war between the states. When he met Mrs. Stowe, he said, "So you are the little woman who started this big war." When the anti-slavery movement reached Indiana, several prominent people banded together and organized the Anti-Slavery League. It was patterned after the society in the East. This was a secret organization, and only those who were trustworthy were invited to join. John Hanson from Pennsylvania was sent here to organize the men. He traveled as a real estate agent and timber buyer. His real name was John Hanover. He selected lieutenants to work with him. They set up a code system that was never broken. The officers and meeting places were named for the local trees like maple, hickory, walnut, and so forth. The organization operated in Indiana from 1850 to 1861. During that time, thousands of fugitive slaves were escorted out of the South into Canada. This is how it worked. The most dangerous part was the work south of the Ohio River. There, the agent of the Anti-Slavery League was pretty much on his own. Some of the agents were music teachers, and they were welcomed into the finest homes. Some were peddlers who passed through the South on a regular schedule. They may have had dress materials and lace and buttons to show the ladies of the house. Some understood geology and mineralogy and traveled the South testing the soil for minerals. They would make friends with a young, intelligent black man and talk to him about freedom. Then he, in turn, would talk to his friends and tell them that they could get away from slavery if they wanted to. While the soil around Green River in Kentucky was being tested for lead, 47 young black men disappeared and was never seen in Kentucky again. One of the slave owners says, there must be an underground railroad under the Ohio River. On the designated night that the slaves were to escape, the agent had an accomplice on hand. This accomplice would take the black fellas to the Ohio River. The agent was careful to have an alibi for that night. Perhaps he was having supper with the slave owners, or maybe he was playing checkers or gambling of some kind. In the morning, when the slaves were reported missing, the hunt would begin, often with bloodhounds. The agents carried a supply of red pepper in their pockets. They would sprinkle this behind every place they had been, and that way the dogs would sniff the red pepper and get all confused and wouldn't be able to follow the scent. When the escapees and their leader reached the Ohio River, the leader would light a turpentine ball to signal a fisherman across the river in a boat. And when this fisherman saw this bright light, he knew to come across and pick up the slaves. There were several places to cross in Indiana. Official crossings were at Diamond Island near West Franklin and Posey County. In Vanderbilt County, the crossing was in the Calvert neighborhood. It was manned by fishermen who supplied fish for the Evansville markets. These fishermen were friends with a man who worked for Willard Carpenter. Mr. Carpenter was not a member of the Anti-Slavery League, but in sympathy with them. He allowed his carriage driver to transport the slaves as far as Gibson County, where they would be met by employees of the League who saw them safely to the next place. Most of the slaves crossing in Evansville were taken to the Cochran Barn Cellar near Oakland City. And the barn cellar is where the University of Oakland City is today. If the bridge was being watched by slave hunters, it was often necessary to reroute them to the Caswell farm near Booneville. The third crossing was at Pigeon Creek near Yankeetown in Warren County. Here the escaping slaves and their leader would be met by Ira Caswell, or one of his men. Once across the river, it was important to get as far away as possible before dawn, because the bounty hunters would be beating the bushes at first light. If it was very late, it was often necessary to hide in a grove of uprooted trees which had been hit by a tornado sometime earlier. Here they would spend the night, the rest of the night and the next day. It was 17 miles from the river to our Caswell's place. Cochran's book that says that once they arrived at Caswell's, they would have the first hot meal that they had had in days. They could have a bath, clean clothes, and any medical treatment they might need. You can imagine what kind of shape they were in, sleeping out in the open, barefooted, running through the briars, and being chased by animals as well as men. And their diet would have to be what friends would leave along the way, or what the agent could get for them. But it would be hard to have it waiting for them in a certain place, but they didn't know when they'd have to be rerouted at any minute. And if Caswell's place was being watched, it would be necessary to have a forced march yet that night on to Oakland City. The Underground Railroad was not an easy road. If all went well, the next night the sleighs would be turned over to George Hill, who lived a short distance west of Linville. Now, Big Creek runs behind the Caswell property. It runs east and west. And they would follow Big Creek till they got to the old canal. Then they followed the canal to Oakland City, where they would go into the barn cellar. Mr. Hill would deliver them to Mr. Cochran. There they would rest until it was safe to deliver them to Dr. Posey, who would hide them in his coal bank near Winslow. Night after night, this secret march went on through Indiana and Michigan until they reached Canada and freedom. In 1999, President Bill Clinton signed a bill to preserve and mark all of the sites of the authentic Underground Railroad stations. The state of Ohio had theirs marked in no time, and they even have a big museum up there in Cincinnati. Due to the coal company now owning the Caswell property, it will be a while before it is marked and made into a park. A lone pear tree marks the place where so many runaway slaves found food, rest, and hope so many years ago. After all these years, that pear tree still bears fruit. Some of the members of the Preservation Committee have planted seed and watched them grow into trees, which have been set out in various places in Warwick County. Les Coomer of Oakland City is in charge of this phase of history. The coal company plans to dig up the tree and move it to Mount Zion Cemetery, where Ira Caswell is buried. Here's the pear tree as it is today. And that's growing out of a stump of the original one. Terre Haute was an important stopover for the Underground Railroad. For several years after the Preservation Bill was signed, St. Mary of the Woods College sponsored a reenactment of the escape to Canada. Some of Ira Caswell's descendants were invited to participate in one of the flights to freedom. We crept through the woods in the dark of night without making a sound. We were chased by men on horseback and by howling dogs. We hid in a barn. Here and there we found fresh water and food along the path. Finally, the pretend path led across a pretend river into a pretend Canada. There we were welcomed with a feast by those who had gone on before. With real food, it wasn't pretend. I was born on the property of the Underground Railroad. I am the great-great-granddaughter of Ira Caswell. And here is some of Ira's descendants that participated. And my relatives from out of town went to the Salvation Army and bought some clothes. And the people on the other side of the river were astonished to see us dressed like escapees. But somebody should have told Fred and some of the others, you don't wear a white shirt when you're escaping after dark. So does anybody have any questions?
That one on the top right is Ira Caswell, isn't it?
Yeah, this is Grandpa Caswell. And this is the fella from Pennsylvania that pretended to buy timber and so forth and led the other guys. And Colonel Cochran, his son wrote the book, and of course Grandpa, Dr. Andrew Lewis, and Dr. John W. Posey, and George Hill from Linville. He also was a minister. And I've been told that our Caswell was so heavy that he couldn't ride a horse on these rounds. He'd have to walk or ride in a buggy or a wagon. That he'd break the horse down. So this is a map of this phase of the Underground Railroad trails. So, well, I appreciate you people all being so nice to sit still and listen at me.
Great. Thank you.
When they moved what was called the old Van Cemetery on the corner of Covert and Green River Road to widen Green River Road, they moved that cemetery over into what was Roselawn across the road. That's my family cemetery. There were 26 unmarked graves in there. That used to be part of the Granger family farm, which is part of my family. And the speculation my grandmother used to say was those were some of the people that had crossed on the railroad.
These have been, yeah.
Could very well have been. I don't know that there've been whether they had some anthropologist take a look at them and see if they were Afro-Americans or not. But they had a large number, and there's articles in the Evansville Press about it.
Oh, wow.
They're good pairs.
Peggy was so nice. She really enjoyed having you come, and she was sorry she couldn't make it, but she wanted me to give you this.
Oh. She knows me, chocolate.
There's a rose with chocolate on top.
Oh my goodness.
Now, you're lucky that you got the chocolate, because Ernie and I was buying that a lot.
Here's a candle to keep your light lit all the time.
Oh, how nice.
And a beautiful card.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Betty, for coming.
Thank you very much.
This is the book of the Underground Railroad, written or discussed by Phyllis Jamison. You know, in the beginning of the book, property of Emily Caswell Morrison, August 13th, 1908, great-granddaughter of Ira Caswell. Phyllis's book, that's her address in the Boonville area. Book written by Colonel William Cochran, the history of the Underground Railroad, conducted by Anti-Slavery League, including many thrilling encounters between those aiding the slaves to escape those trying to recapture them, by Colonel William M. Cochran, author of The Pioneer History of Indiana in Oakland City, Indiana. And the press, published company was J.W. Cochran Printing Company in Oakland City, Indiana. Right year was 1915 by William M. Cochran. Paperback edition of the same book, History of the Underground Railroad, picture on the front of the book, the Heritage Classic, same printing company, but this is a paperback version.